All right, guys. So at this point, you should have watched the crash course video on why study government and answered those questions in that assignment. And now we'll get started in the content. So Unit 1, as you've seen, is called citizenship. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more tomorrow. First, we're going to kind of give hopefully a recap of some stuff that you learned in world history as well as American history. When it comes to citizenship, citizenship is defined in some ways by what type of government you live under. And so, right now, we're just going to look really briefly at some different forms of government. And then remember, you'll have a discussion board to complete after this. Okay, so forms of government. First of all, and Craig covered a lot of this in the crash course video, but why do we need government? And so, what purposes does government serve? Usually, when we think of government, we think of politicians, we think of government officials, we think of laws that we would rather not follow, we think of restrictions and things like that. And all of those are elements of government. Those are all kind of negatives at times. Those are things to be concerned about. Those are things to be frustrated about. But when it comes to the greater purpose, why do we actually need government? And what purposes do they serve? All right. And so, first of all, they keep peace and order. And the biggest way they do this, and I know there's a lot in the news right now about police departments and defunding police and what role should police play. This is only part of this first bullet here, keep peace and order. The main way the government keeps peace and order is through laws. And so, again, sometimes we think of laws as being restrictive. They're telling you what you cannot do. But remember, when they're telling you that you cannot do something, that is also saying that someone else cannot do it as well. So, next unit, we'll get into something called the social contract, in which we basically give up the rights to do certain things to make sure we maintain safety for ourselves. For example, most people are okay that there's a law against murder, right? So you willingly give up your right to murder um, in the hopes of you'll be protected in society, if that makes sense. So think about things that you don't want done to you, whether that be robbed or assaulted. Um, that those are things that you're willing to give up the quote unquote right to do to others to make sure that you're protected as well. So keep peace and order is a big one, and so that comes through the legal system, that comes through laws that are passed, and that comes through the enforcement of laws. All right, so maintaining order in society, and this isn't necessarily maintaining order in terms of really strong authority or authoritarian governments, but it's basically just allowing some order for society to exist. All right. Secondly, to protect and defend you as a nation. So this is going to be kind of more on a national scale. We need the government to protect us and defend us as a nation. And again, there are going to be many debates and arguments on how much protection do we need, how much military do we need. When we get into later units, we'll see how much money the United States spends on our military as opposed to other countries. Some people think it's way too much. Some people are going to think that we still don't spend enough on the military. And again, that's going to be up for debate. But most people are going to want a government that is going to protect them and make them feel somewhat safe in terms of being able to be protected from invasion or attack or other countries. A third one is a big one that we tend to overlook when we talk negatively about the government. The government provides services. All right. So usually when this is done on a class day, like when we're in class, I always say, we all benefited from the government today because we all got here using the roads. You're benefiting from the government even now as you learn remotely from home by being able to get an education for free. And we'll get into the nuts and bolts of, the importance of education and things like that. Some people say, well, I wish we didn't have that service, but again, we'll talk about that later. But the government provides a lot of services. roads, infrastructure, like I said, schools. A lot of people depend on the government for assistance through food stamps or other types of public housing and things like that. So the government provides a lot of services that if they didn't, we would just have to figure out a way to pay for on our own. And then lastly, the government maintains institutions. Institutions can range from family to religious institutions to educational institutions. So the government just allows institutions to exist and make sure they're protected. All right, so again, hopefully this is going to be some recap here on forms of government that you learned maybe in world history and American history. All right, so the first we're going to look at is democracy. Democracy literally means rule by the people. And so in democracy, we would say the people have the political power. All right, and underneath democracy, there's two main types we look at. First of all, there's direct democracy, and you see the picture down there. If you remember in world history, learning about Athens and learning about ancient Greece, the Athenians were the ones that essentially came up with democracy, this idea that all the people should be able to participate in the government, not just through voting, or voting in officials, but voting in policy, voting in what laws are created. They would create the laws themselves. Now, as we'll see, and I'm sure as you've heard before in class, this term, all citizens, what did it mean to be a citizen? Now, in this sense, in the ancient world, a citizen, in terms of being able to vote and have a quote unquote stake in society, you had to be male. Sorry, ladies. You had to be free, which fortunately we all are today. And then also you had to own land. All right. So land ownership, if you remember, is basically a status of wealth. So land was kind of how you determined what your stake was in society, and in a lot of ways what authority you had. So it was considered, and this goes into the early American ideal of government and who should be able to make laws, is this idea of if you don't have a stake in society, in terms of like you don't have something like land or wealth, then you didn't really deserve the right to determine policy. And obviously some abuse and corruption came with that as well. So direct democracy means the people are directly involved, meaning everybody that's eligible not only votes for officials, they vote on the laws themselves. Now, direct democracy is the purest form of democracy, but there's a problem that happens with direct democracy. Once you get too many people, it becomes difficult to be able to maintain. And so Rome, they took that and then they formed the Republic, if you remember that term from world history. And so as Rome started expanding, they said, we like this idea of democracy, but there's way too many people to try to be involved here. And so they said, what we're going to do is we're going to vote for people to represent us. All right. And then those representatives will make the policy and make laws and things like that. That essentially is what we have in America. We have 435 people in the federal government that make laws for the entire nation, over 330 million now. Okay. Really more than that, but that's just kind of a rough estimate. And so think about if all eligible voters in America had to vote on every single law, that would get overwhelming. There'd be a lot there, and a lot of people just wouldn't want to do it. All right. And so Rome creates this idea of the representative democracy or the republic, where you elect people to represent you. Now, you would say, well, those 435 people in America making the laws, that's not the people having the power. But remember that people are elected. And so we still have the power at the end of the day because we can vote people out of office. All right. So democracy is ruled by the people. You go to the reverse side, autocracy. You can maybe get a reminder from that graphic there. Autocracy is where an autocrat rules, a form of government where one person is in control, and there's a few different types of autocracy. First of all, you got the monarchy. Sure, you remember that from world history. Your kings and your queens, all right? Power is usually inherited. That's why you've got people's names with all those Roman numerals after them. Okay, kind of the famous ones are in France. You had the Louis that go all the way up to, I think, Louis the 17th or maybe even the 19th. Just kept naming his kid Louis. So you're king because your dad was king or your mom was queen, and that's that. All right. Now, underneath monarchy, just like democracy, there's a couple different kind of subsets. First of all, you got absolute monarchy, and as that term would imply, and the monarch in an absolute monarchy has full and absolute authority. All right. So if you ever kind of heard the term or the phrase off with their head, they kind of use that, in movies and things like that during kind of this time period. Well, that was basically the authority that a king had. If King Louis in France was an example of an absolute monarchy, wanted someone beheaded, that was basically it. Don't worry about a trial. Don't worry about witnesses. Don't worry about reasons or evidence. That was that. Okay. And so in an absolute monarchy, the monarch or the king usually was not only did not only have absolute authority, they're also above the law. So they could create law essentially, have a big impact at least, and then also not be accountable to that law either. And we'll talk about that more in the next unit, how that kind of stopped. All right, constitutional monarchy. Most monarchs today, or most monarchies, are actually what's referred to as constitutional monarchy. So unlike absolute monarchy, the monarch or the king or queen is still accountable to the law. All right, and so a constitutional monarchy has a constitution. Now in America, we hear the Constitution and we think of that just being an American thing sometimes. The definition of constitution is just a written form of government. All right. And so almost every country today has a constitution. So in a constitutional monarchy, it is a king or queen that's still limited by that constitution. It's very similar to representative democracy today. People in England or Britain, for example, you got Queen Elizabeth down there. Britain is ruled, or the lawmakers in Britain, if you've ever heard of the term parliament, pretty similar to how our system works here. The monarch doesn't really have much power. They're referred to more as what you call a figurehead. They're kind of a symbol of the country. They do have some authority, but not what you would think in terms of days of old, where the king and queen are just, calling people out to be executed, making, big overarching laws for the nation, and there's no one to check that power. All right. Autocracy. When we really think of one person ruling, a lot of times we think of dictatorship. All right. So we've got Kim Jong-un, or Little Rocket Man down here, as some like to call him. We've got Fidel Castro of Cuba. And then, of course, we've got Hitler down in the bottom there. Now, a dictator usually gets their power by force. And now people always go back and say, well, Hitler was elected. Yeah, that's great. That's fine. And, you can get into that. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is a leader that basically essentially has absolute and total authority. And they either got their position through force or through manipulation of the military. And that's how they maintain power. Okay, so they usually have the backing of the military. That's also why, if you'll see, most of these dictators, when they appear, they're always wearing a military uniform. So it's very important to keep that symbolism alive. Usually they've got all these medals and stripes and awards and stuff that don't really mean anything, but just to kind of set them apart and as the leader of the military. But they always kind of give that persona that they are the head of the military and they've got the military's backing. All right. So a lot of times dictatorships can still be passed on through heredity. Kim Jong-un is the grandson of the original leader of North Korea, for example. Fidel Castro, I believe it's his nephew, that rules in Cuba now. Hitler, obviously, was either committed suicide. Well, he committed suicide. There's some debate on whether he was assassinated, but he committed suicide, and then Germany kind of comes under the hands of the Allies after Europe. So his dictatorship um, died with him, essentially. All right, and so they have total, complete control. And when you think of just like really, really big abuses of power and stuff like that, that's what you're thinking of with dictatorships. They have to kind of exercise that total and complete control to make sure they stay in power. All right, and then you've got the oligarchy. It's similar to an autocracy, but instead of just one person, you've got a small group of people. And so oligarchies officially kind of existed kind of still back during this time period. We would think of in the ancient world, the idea was, well, one person having, if you've ever heard the term absolute power corrupts absolutely, the idea was if you got just one person in power, they would become corrupted. So you kind of have a few people to rule, and then they kind of keep each other in check. Only problem is sometimes they would become abusive as a group. Now, today, like I said, you don't have any like official oligarchies, but you have countries that are debatably oligarchies. Some people would say America's an oligarchy because of the role that money and wealth plays. If you look at how long certain senators and representatives have been in power, they're just able to stay in power through lobbying and through just a number of means. Russia, we know about Putin, but Russia is essentially an oligarchy in terms of who's actually in power and a small group at the top that's able to control a lot of things. All right, you got a theocracy. You might recognize the Pope down there. This flag over here, I believe, is Turkey's flag. A theocracy is a government that's ruled by a religious leader. Theo is a prefix that essentially means God. And so theocracy is a nation that's basically built upon a religious system, and so their laws are based off religion. Your rule of thumb, if you're trying to figure out if a country is a theocracy or not, is if you look at their flag, if their flag has a religious symbol on it. So, for example, the Vatican City, it's got a cross. A lot of your Middle Eastern nations that use the Quran as their kind of their text that they base laws on. Most of those countries have the crescent moon symbol of Islam. If you've ever seen the flag of Israel, it's got the Star of David, right? So they're going to use the Torah and some other Jewish texts. The Torah is the first few books of the Bible that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all use in some way, but Judaism stops after kind of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then they've got some other religious texts too. So basically, you got your laws in the religious text, and you use those to determine your law system within your country. And then lastly, we've got anarchy. So whenever we think of, government's this, government's that, I wish we didn't have a government. Well, that's when you have anarchy. And a couple of different things could result in that. Have you ever seen this movie? Back in the day now, I guess, early mid-2000s, I believe this came out. Will Smith, living in New York with his dog and a bunch of zombies. This movie does a good job showing what would happen if government didn't exist to provide services. All right, so you've seen that movie. Now, obviously, a lot of this comes down to people have abandoned the city, but you see just a lot of things. What happens when people just aren't around and the government's not there to keep things up? So buildings are collapsing; they're dilapidated. All right, sorry, someone came in to take my temperature. Make sure I can stay today. So I Am Legend shows kind of just what would happen without government and kind of keep up the infrastructure. And obviously there's no, system of laws in place anymore. Will Smith walks around with his AK-47 and traps zombies and all sorts of other stuff. So the best example probably in modern days is of anarchy is the Purge movies. Now, I've never seen the Purge movies. I've seen the trailers. I know what they're about. And they're essentially that. They are anarchy for 24 hours. And so if you've ever seen the Purge movies or know what those are, that would kind of be an example of no government. All right. So now, I know a lot of kids say, we need a purge. Well, I find more often than not the kids that want to purge are the ones that I doubt would survive the purge. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, really think about like what type of society you would have if that was an ongoing thing. So just knowing that there's no accountability, no responsibility. Now, obviously, it kind of plays on some of these people wouldn't have any type of morality, but you kind of see what would or what could result at least from the absence of government. Okay, so that was kind of a recap of the major forms of government. All right, and so hopefully some clarification there. So make sure you, after you watch this, go back and look at the discussion board that asks you which form of government you would want to live under the most and why, and which you'd want to live under the least and why. All right.